Greetings, viewers. This is Matthew from Jazz Crazy Records reporting live from the Jazz Bunker. As you know, I love old 78 RPM records, but not everyone who appreciates old music has the means to play 78s. And there are a lot of 78s out there that it just isn't possible to collect without buckets of cash and record detectives scouring the planet to find them. So today I'm going to talk about an excellent new CD release that I highly recommend for fans of early jazz and 78s. And I also have a very special guest joining me to do that. So stick around and get hooked up with some great new/old music. The very early years of recorded jazz often is overlooked by jazz historians. The original Dixieland Jazz Band often gets a nod, and then we're off to talking about Louis Armstrong and the Hot Five and Duke Ellington. But as I've discovered through collecting 78 records, there was a lot of great music produced in that time that was exciting, dynamic, and formative to later developments in jazz. And today we're going to look at a new release from Archeophone Records that takes a deep dive into the work of saxophonist Loren McMurray, a Kansas-born saxophonist who recorded extensively over a 3-year period in the early 1920s. The release is titled The Moaningest Moan of them all, the jazz saxophone of Loren McMurray, 1920 to 1922. It features 50 super clean digital transfers from 78 RPM records on 2 CDs, assembled and curated by Colin Hancock and released by Archeophone Records. I'm thrilled to share that this release has recently been nominated for a Grammy Award for Best Historical Record. Now, if you don't know who Loren McMurray is, don't feel bad. He's a relatively unsung hero of early jazz who recorded with a number of different bands and had just started his own band as a leader when he tragically passed away at the age of 25. This 2 CD set documents some of the highlight tracks of his short but prolific career. It includes 50 tracks of McMurray's work with bands such as Eddie Kuhn, Markel's Orchestra, Harry Raderman, Bailey's Lucky Seven, Lannon's Southern Serenaders, the Bar Harbor Society Orchestra, the Virginians, and the original Memphis Five. The transfers on this set all sound fantastic, and we can thank Richard Martin for that, who did all the digital restoration and remastering on this release, and a whole cast of collectors who lent their pristine copies of McMurray records to the project for digital transfers. It's incredible to hear all this McMurray in one place, and I could be wrong, but I think this is the first serious retrospective of his work on record. This album is a great visual joy. The design is quite lovely, and the booklet that comes with the set is full of photographs and artifacts that I've never seen before. It contains a wealth of information that is really such a delight to read and take in. The excellent liner notes were written by producer Colin Hancock and noted collector, publisher, and jazz historian Mark Berresford. They are detailed, well-researched, and make a convincing case that Loren McMurray played an important, under-acknowledged role in the development of improvised jazz and the ascendancy of the saxophone as a melody instrument. Here, McMurray really does get his well-deserved 15 minutes of fame. Now, I could tell you more about the release, but I'm very excited to bring on a very special guest, our very first guest to the channel, who's going to tell us all about this project. All right, viewers, we have a very special guest joining us in the Jazz Bunker today, virtually, a gifted jazz artist in his own right who has led and recorded with several bands, a columnist for the Vintage Jazz Mart magazine. There's my plug for that. Noted record collector, doctoral student at the University of Texas School of Law, and Grammy-nominated music producer, Mr. Colin Hancock.
Glad to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining us and being the very first guest on the channel.
Cool. No, I'm so glad you're doing this.
So, Colin, you are one of the 3 co-producers on the Moaningest Moan of them all, the jazz saxophone of Loren McMurray, 1920 to 1922. I wanted to start off by reading the first paragraph of the liner notes that you co-wrote with Mark, because
Mhm.
I think it frames the project really well. Picture jazz without John Coltrane, Sonny Rollins, or Charlie Parker. All were innovators, stars of their day, and helped to define what the saxophone, an instrument practically synonymous with jazz, could do. It seems ludicrous trying to tell the story of jazz without them, and nobody sensible would try. However, when it comes to the first champion of jazz saxophone, historians haven't been quite as careful. You may hear names like Coleman Hawkins and Frankie Trumbauer occasionally get kicked around in music classes about the early days, but those innovators made their strides later in their careers. Others preceded them, and none impacted the music and the instrument quite like Loren McMurray, or Mac, as his friends called him. So when I read that paragraph for the first time, when I got the set, I realized this wasn't just an ordinary, yeah, we were going to reissue small transfers. Like, you're on a mission
Mhm.
to kind of reframe McMurray's career and elevate him into the trajectory of the early jazz pantheon of influential performers. So can you talk a little bit about what about Mac you feel had such an impact on early jazz music?
Absolutely. So, Mac was really the first jazz saxophonist to consistently improvise on record. Not in person, certainly, not, live or anything like that, but on record and in the recording industry and in the fledgling jazz recording industry. He was really the first one to kind of step out of the norm of playing the instrument as a novelty instrument and playing it as a jazz instrument and improvising consistently and playing it in that kind of style.
Awesome. So let's back up a little bit. Tell us about Loren McMurray. Who was he? Where did he come from? And how did he get involved in the early jazz scene?
Yeah. So Loren McMurray was born in McPherson, Kansas. He's an alto saxophonist. Also played a little bit of soprano sax and bass clarinet and baritone saxophone, but primarily an alto saxophonist. He was born into a fairly musical family. His dad was the postmaster of McPherson. His granddad had been the county clerk, but his dad also led a very successful saxophone ensemble, and before that, a brass band. But the saxophone ensemble began in sort of the late aughts into the early teens, with his mom on the tenor sax, his dad on soprano sax, and Loren on the alto. And the group grew from a trio into a full blown like 10-piece band, with some other members of the community in it, and they became very, very popular in McPherson, and then in central Kansas, and then all over Kansas and Nebraska. They toured. They even talked about going to the Panama Pacific Exposition in San Francisco, 1915, and they were just very well known in the area. But Mac actually at first kind of was not really into that world. He kind of felt like, oh, well, my dad's making me do this, and I don't really want to do this. But over time, he grew to like it, and actually ended up kind of striking on his own. And then his dad unfortunately passed away in the mid-teens, and that sort of was the catalyst that led to Mac going in a different direction. So instead of playing the novelty kind of ragtime and light classical infused music that his family band was playing, he decided to go into the direction of popular music. He played with a family friend in Salina, Kansas for a little bit, but then ended up going to Kansas City, where he heard a lot of jazz and ragtime influenced music in person for the first time, and then toured with the community quartet in the Chautauqua circuit, which also exposed him to a lot of music. The piano player was from Louisiana. I think there was a member from Chicago. So he got all these influences after moving away from home. Even though he came up in a musical community, it was just a much more expansive one than central Kansas. So when that happened, he really kind of grew his own style. And I think being on the road really especially helped kind of propel him, because by the time he got back to Kansas City, he was really seen as this really, really fantastic musician and was really in demand. I mean, and in demand with the top names, like the Coon Sanders Band hired him briefly, Willard Robeson hired him briefly, and Eddie Coon, who was like the most popular kind of dance band leader of that time, late teens, also hired him and Emile Chiquette, who's a violinist. And with that, that's how Mac kind of went from regional popularity to kind of, Kansas City popularity to national popularity, because the Eddie Coon Band toured and they recorded. And, when I went to the Kansas City, the UMKC archives, Chuck Haddix, who's in charge of the archives there, the Mar Sound archives, pulled out some scans of McMurray's scrapbook. And in it are all of these telegraphs from band leaders saying, come join me. I'm leading a successful band in New York or in Atlanta or wherever, and I'll pay you really well. Just come and join this band. So he was very, very much in demand, especially in the industry early on, and that kind of is the reason why he moved to New York and became so influential and popular.
Yeah, you mentioned developing his own style, and of course, the name of the CD set, the Moaningest Moan of them all. For jazz fans who have never heard Loren McMurray, can you describe the style of playing? What made his sound that Moaningest Moan of them all uniquely
Yeah.
his?
Yeah, so if you listen to the sort of handful of saxophonists from that time who recorded, you have kind of a spectrum, right? You have the most, focused on tone and technicality with people like Rudy Wiedoeft. And then you have the most humorous and kind of, not very serious playing from people like Dwayne Sawyer and Paul Beasy. And they were equally popular in their own ways, but what they weren't trying to do in either kind of area was to play in a more jazz sensibility, with the syncopations of jazz, with the improvisational ideas of jazz, with the influences of New Orleans and the Mississippi River and the Missouri River and African American music and Latin American music and things like that. And I think what sets apart McMurray and what kind of defines his sound is he has a very different approach and more of a jazz approach. He plays with a very, very light tone, which, like I said, Wiedoeft did that, but he combines the light tone with the improvisational ideas of jazz musicians, particularly clarinet players, but some other saxophonists too, and other instrumentalists. And that combination is what made him unique at the time. It was combining a bunch of different ideas. I mean, it is what jazz is in a sense. It's the combination of a bunch of different sounds and ideas that really existed in the United States at the time. And that combination became his sound.
Yeah, and I think for modern jazz fans who are used to this idea that the saxophone is the center of the jazz soloist universe, this idea that at that time that wasn't necessarily the case, and you discussed in the liner notes certainly how Mac's playing was very influenced by clarinetists as
Mm-hmm.
well as some of the saxophone players you mentioned. How did Mac and his playing help promote the saxophone as kind of elevate the saxophone as a featured melody instrument?
Absolutely. So I think part of it was luck. I mean, just being the voice of the lead, the melody voice in the Eddie Coon band, and on those records, because he was chosen to be that musician in the band, and particularly because Eddie Coon Emile Chiquette, the violinist, didn't make the recording sessions. I think it probably to listeners gave the impression of him being this melody voice, an important voice. So, from the record perspective, that's one side of it. But I think it's also just kind of because he was used to doing that, to being a melody instrument, and in a saxophone sextet context as well, and things like that. He had a really strong foundation in that. But then when he went to New York, he didn't have to be that. So he had that kind of confidence and approach, which came from all of those different places. But because he no longer had to be the melody voice all the time, and had to be kind of held down from that, he was able to and this is especially clear on the Markel's records, he was able to kind of fly on top, and still, stick close to a melody line. This is early in improvisation. It's not, like he's Ornette Coleman, but he is straying away, and he's playing counterpoint, and it's creating a lot of momentum. And I think that's really special, because if you listen to what other saxophonists were doing at the time on record, most were either playing melody or a cello line, a written out cello line, or playing novelty variations. But people weren't improvising with the rest of the melody on top, around, and creating this kind of texture that he was so good at doing.
So McMurray passed away quite suddenly at a very young age. Had he lived, what do you think he might have gone on to do? Would we have seen more California Thumpers records?
Absolutely. So I think you have to kind of read in between the lines of where his career was at the time of his death. One of the things we discovered pretty much at the end of all the research was that the Don Parker Melody Boys, Western Melody Boys sessions, have a lot of the California Thumpers on them, and there's even one session where McMurray is with them, which didn't make it on the CD. There's too many records to ever include on one set. But you can hear the same feel as the Thumpers records, and the same kind of energy and momentum building through breaks and solos and stuff. So I think there would have been more of that. The other person I look at is Batty DeMarcus, who was McMurray's section mate in the Whiteman Saxophone Sextet, and he was McMurray's replacement in Bailey's Lucky Seven, and with a bunch of Sam Lannon guys. And he continued to do those recording sessions for almost a year before going to the UK to play with the Savoy Havana Band, and then coming back and recording with Arnold Johnson, and he was friends with Hoagie Carmichael. I mean, and doing radio. So I think looking at Don Parker and Batty DeMarcus and similar saxophonists who were influenced by McMurray and kind of came up maybe a year or so after McMurray really became a major player, but we're of a similar generation of musicians. I think he would have been active in the scene. I certainly think he would have continued to do stuff with the Thumpers, because it even says in his obituary he had a session, or I think two sessions, on the books for Pathé and Edison with the Thumpers the week he died.
Oh man.
So yeah, I know. I mean, it really is remarkable, especially when you look at the amount of stuff he did in 1922 alone. I think he would have been one of the greats of the 20s saxophone scene. I think there's a possibility he might have been better remembered than, say, Benny Kruger or Clyde Dorr, especially because of the jazz sensibility. And the thing I wonder about the most is, because he wasn't playing with such a novelty approach, would he have been more present on records of some of the other names who we consider to be the greats from a little bit later? Like, would he have recorded with, say, a Red Nichols or a Bix Beiderbecke? I mean, he played the same role as Bix in the Whiteman organization as a hot man. He, had the same proficiency as somebody like a Red Nichols. So I wonder.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a part of the liner notes you talk about after he passed away, and this massive memorial service in Kansas City, and there's a 150-piece band and all these flower arrangements sent by band leaders. Why do you think Mac was kind of forgotten, and why was he under-acknowledged for so long?
There's a few reasons for that. I think the most glaring is the acoustic era. I think a lot of these recordings were made in a time when acoustic recording technology was the main thing. And I mean, if you even look at what people say about the King Oliver Creole Jazz Band records, or Wolverines, or anybody before a microphone, I mean, it's distant for people. And you add to that the fact that until really the last 15 years, and especially the last 5 years, restoration technology has not been stellar. It's been good, and there have been great people like John R.T. Davies and Rich who did these. But thanks to better understanding of technology, better transfer equipment, better understanding of what copies to use, and all that nerdy stuff, it's been much easier to connect with this music. Another reason, to be completely honest, I think he was a white jazz musician, and white jazz musicians from the time between the original Dixieland Jazz Band and Bix, really, maybe the New Orleans Rhythm Kings, but especially Bix, kind of get overlooked. And it's interesting that the most famous white band, other than Paul Whiteman from that era, is the original Memphis Five. And McMurray was pretty much a member of the original Memphis Five, if that tells you anything. So I think that's an important thing. And you know, I mean, it's a difficult conversation to have, but it is a truthful one of the fact that a lot of jazz from that era gets ignored, white or black or whomever, but especially white jazz musicians, which is a shame because there's so much great music from so many different people from that time. Just look at Loren McMurray. I think the last reason I would say is he recorded a lot of sides with dance band musicians and just dance bands and dance orchestras. And until recently, also, those bands have also been overlooked. I mean, I remember when I was like 10 or 12, whenever I would look for 78s in the store and I'd see something by the Knickerbocker Orchestra or Carl Fenton, I'd be like, whatever, I'm looking for something cool. And I really am sad that that was my approach, because I'm sure there were great things on those records that I just overlooked. And I know that to be true with so many collectors, you know, sifting through 78s and seeing stuff from that era, people generally kind of toss it to the side for the reasons that I mentioned a second ago. And it's just not true, as is the case with so many things.
I think that's one of the things I enjoyed about the set so much, is going back to my collection, trying to find, you know, sides where he played on it and understand, oh, this is a record like I got and just kind of tossed aside and never really gave a close listen to. So I really appreciate it for that reason. So let's talk about the CD project and how it kind of came together. How'd you build momentum around this idea of compiling all these records together and putting something out?
Yeah, so it was kind of a long and strange process that led to it, but it's kind of neat too. So I love working with Rich and Megan at Archeophone. They do such great work. I've been a fan since I was a kid. Actually, like my dad even would buy CDs. I think we had the Before Radio CD, and so I've always wanted to do stuff with them. And we did the Gus Henshin project a few years ago. So I always have had a rapport with them. And I have recently, well, recent is relative, at least for the past 4 years or so, have been focused on doing a project on the Benny Moten OKs with them, because those are some of my favorite records of all time. And one of my favorite parts of those is Harlan Leonard, the alto saxophonist. And he's always been interesting to me because he really plays in a style which now I know is so similar to Loren McMurray on those, but played in a style that kind of was different from what a lot of other saxophonists were doing at the time. And Mark Berresford published that wonderful article in VJM about McMurray. And I remember buying a McMurray Jeanette at a record show maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And just, you know, the name was floating around. But then during the pandemic was really when things started to pick up. We had a weekly Zoom call with a bunch of the jazz musicians, traditional jazz musicians, where we'd spin records. And on those Zoom calls, the name of Loren McMurray came up all the time. People just saying, you know, oh man, like, I love those Loren McMurray records. Do you have any, blah, blah, blah. And everybody started to find the ones that they had and kind of reference Mark's article to see, you know, which ones are which. And, you know, debates ensued. Oh, I think that's him. Oh, I don't actually think that's him, blah, blah, blah. And so the discussion became, should we make a McMurray discography? And so I had never made a discography before. I thought that was kind of a difficult task for people who want to do difficult tasks. And so I took a crack first at a Sidney Aradine discography, which was much easier because it's like maybe 6 or 7 pages worth of records. And when I did that and we kind of went over it, everybody was like, okay, this is cool. What else are we going to do? And then I thought, okay, let's try Loren McMurray. So I made a preliminary one and I sent it to Mark, and he said, this is great. However, since writing my article, I've made some other discoveries. And I was kind of like, okay, well, let's make some edits and see where this goes. And then Michael Malisoff, a historian and a friend online and stuff, he's also a professor at LSU. He posted somewhere online that there were alternate takes to the California Thumpers records. And for me, that was kind of the spark, because we've been talking about McMurray and discussing all that kind of stuff and, joking around, hey, wouldn't it be cool if there were a McMurray album or something like that? But then when the most important records he made, we find out there are alternates. And then I heard them and they had different solos and things like that. It was kind of like, okay, now's the time. And so I actually was talking to my partner, Shelly, about this. And she said, well, I know you're interested in the Moten project, but why not do a McMurray one? And I said, okay, I'll pitch it and see. And Rich and Megan totally were into it. And it's it's exactly the kind of stuff they love. They love underdogs and they love telling stories and anything with primary sources and, introducing new music to people. And so it ended up being really fun because it was kind of like discovering McMurray again and learning more about who he was and really analyzing all of these, hundreds of recordings that this guy made and alternate takes and different labels and just seeing, what is best. And I mean, it was tough. I mean, we were deciding what to include up until like maybe a few weeks before we finally sent stuff in to get published, because there's just too much, which, speaks to his talent and speaks to how busy he was. But it was great. And we went to, I went to Kansas City twice for this. The first time to do some research with Chuck Haddix, and Russell Fine, who's sort of working on the Moten project with me with Archeophone. He was doing more Moten stuff and I was doing more Mac stuff. And then I went again to get the layout of the city and just see where things were and what Kansas City was back then. And that really helped with understanding this too, seeing like, okay, where was the dance school where the Eddie Kuhn band played all the time? Where was Fairyland or Electric Park and stuff like that? So that was kind of the process around it. We worked with a few other really great researchers. Javier Sorialasso helped us with some discographical stuff. Michael McQuaid helped us with a lot of the lingo around saxophone playing and early saxophones, which is important too, understanding why does a saxophone sound the way it sounds in 1920. And Ralph Wondrashek and just a bunch of people. So it was a very fun process, also working with Mark and his research. He's a fun guy to work with. And yeah.
What are some of your personal favorites out of the 50 tracks on this collection?
Oh yeah. I mean, the Markells Lonesome Mama Blues is like just such a masterpiece to me. And it's such a, like, even though it's a New York band, aside from McMurray, it has such a Kansas City sound. And it has that kind of loose, syncopated novelty sound that a lot of Benny Moten stuff had from a few years later. And, there's obviously the Benny Moten connection with that one too, with the solo. But that whole record is just so fantastic. And by the same token, High Brown Blues by Markells is also got that really like energetic, it's like energetic society music. It's so interesting. Like they call it double beat in the press from the time, but basically the way it worked was you had Keith Pittman on bass sax, who was really he kind of came up in the saxophone sextet sound on that instrument. So it's not like Adrian Rollini. It is really tuba-like bass sax playing. But it's a groove still. It's a really heavy groove, which is cool because it stomps. But then on top of that, you have banjo playing these eighth notes, this syncopated sound. So it's like moving slowly, but moving fast on top of it. And then you have the melody line, which is harmonized through most of the horns. And then McMurray flying on top. It's just really energetic and elastic. And I just love the sound of that band. And then obviously the Thumpers records are great. And Truly by the Knickerbocker Orchestra, which is just the Eddie Elkins band, is like just as, I think, just as important an example of what a good improviser can do to an ensemble as anything Armstrong did with Henderson a few years later. I mean, he plays this crazy solo, and then the band just shoots out of the gate after that. And Armstrong was an innovator in his own right and did it his way for the first time, but it's not the first example of somebody soloing and causing an ensemble to swing.
What other jazz players did Mac influence at the time? Where can his legacy be most distinctly heard?
Yeah, I mean, the most clear is Batty DeMarcus, and you have to wonder how much of that was him loving Mac, which we have the audio of the interviews he did with George Kay, and he loved McMurray. I mean, he says it many times. But you also have to wonder how much of it was, I have a job to do to replace my friend. But then Ross Gorman, Doc Berenson, Keith Pittman, I mean, all of the guys in that scene. Gene Fosdick is another one who, you listen to Gene Fosdick before he met McMurray and played with McMurray versus after, and there's just such a difference he's just so much more relaxed. Don Clark is another name, Don Parker. I mean, really all of the top Reed men, but then Coleman Hawkins. I mean, all of the versions of Dick Dee Blues you hear totally have that same kind of feel. And Hawk was in KC during the time that McMurray was kind of wrapping up his time with Eddie Kuhn. And then Hawk was in New York when McMurray was in New York, and they recorded some of the same songs. So I don't think that's just a coincidence. Harlan Leonard. I mean, there are so many names and so many different people. I think the Thiel brothers who played with Coon Sanders band. Just so many of these saxophonists who, a lot of them heard him in person, but many of whom also heard the records.
Yeah, it's interesting. After hearing it and becoming more familiar with his sound and the slap tonguing, like every time I'd hear something, oh, I think that's him, and then I'd look it up. It's like, oh, that's 1926.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, or so I feel like there's a lot of players that definitely internalized that style he had.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and it's interesting. Before we did this project, it seemed a little bit daunting to kind of distinguish the influence lines from McMurray versus Benny Kruger versus Rudy Wiedoeft. But now that I've listened to so much of this and listened to so much of those other guys too, I hear licks and I hear phrases and I hear things that I can trace to one or trace to another. And Benny Kruger was certainly also a huge influence and an influence for a longer time. But I think as far as improvisation goes, I think McMurray might have had a bigger impact, and certainly did earlier on.
So this release has just been nominated for a Grammy in the category of Best Historical Album. So congratulations on that
Thank you.
nomination. Just how does that feel as a music producer, as someone who just kind of happened into this project and made it happen? Tell me about the moment you first heard about the nomination.
Well, I mean, I was thrilled. It's encouraging because, like I said a few minutes ago, the acoustic era is just so overlooked by so many people, and expectations aren't necessarily high. We got some great reviews and press around it, and a lot of love in Kansas City and in McPherson and throughout the Midwest, which was cool. And the jazz musician community, I mean, so many jazz musicians were happy about this, just especially obviously saxophone players. But I was just happy that this project happened. And I think knowing that there is enough interest for it to get that kind of recognition, just it just is so encouraging about this era. And I think I also just thought, what in the world would he say about it if he were here now? Because I mean, he was such an innovator and had such an interesting story, but he also was doing a job and he was making the most out of it. But it was getting to him towards the end, and you hear that in some of the letters that he wrote home about just being overworked and kind of exhausted. And so I just wonder, would this be something that would make him smile, thinking, oh, 100 years later, all those things that I was doing, riding around town, trying to get to a session or do a gig late at night or something, people are still talking about it and appreciating it 100 years later. I'm sure he'd find some pride in that, which is cool.
Yeah, it's super cool to get that acknowledgement. And, I'm just hoping for another Herbie Hancock moment. One of my favorite moments in Grammy history was when Herbie won the Grammy for Best Album, over Kanye, and
Yeah.
everybody's kind of like, wait, who? You can tell people in the room didn't even know who he was, or just thought of him as, oh, the guy who did Rocket.
Yeah.
But so hopefully we get a moment like that.
That would
Are
be
you
cool.
all planning to attend the Grammys?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I didn't get to go in 2021 because it was remote. So I'm excited to actually hang out on the red carpet this time.
For sure. That is going to be so exciting. So last question, what's next? New projects on the horizon? Are you going to get back into the Moten set? You have other ideas? Is it going to be a volume 2 of the McMurray set? What can we expect?
So Moten is definitely under works. It's been such a cool process now because with those records, they're so important, but they, like McMurray, they've been really overlooked, and they just have not been transferred really that well, to be honest. And that for me is the most aggravating thing because okay, their acoustic technology, including their remote acoustic technology, was remarkable for the time. I mean, there's so much depth and bass and clarity in these records, and that kind of has been recognized for some of the stuff they've done, especially the Hot Fives, but not for these. They've always been kind of seen as like, oh, this is pre-Basie, pre-Durham, Walter Page. So this is when they were still a little ragtime band from blah, blah, blah. No, that's not true. This is the beginning of all of that. And that needs to be heard. So our focus has been finding the cleanest copies of these, and we're just about there. We recently got Joe Buzzard's copy of one of them in like new old stock, and I have one in new old stock. I mean, we pretty much have everything E plus or better, which that'll make Rich's job easier, less noisy work to transfer and restore. And we can focus on that really, and the music of it, which they just haven't really been appreciated the way they should. Also, the blues vocal sides that band did with Mary Bradford and Ada Brown are so fantastic, especially when you hear a clean copy. You hear the dynamics, you hear the band kind of coming in, when the soloists end to play instrumental stuff. And, these guys were like 16, 17, 18 years old at the time. And they played with such energy and the raw kind of Midwestern, like Southwestern groove. And it's just been hard to appreciate until recently. So that's going to be cool. And then I'm also working with another friend on a project on a very, very early, and by very early, I mean 1880s, 1890s orchestra that recorded for Edison and US and all those brown wax cylinder companies. So a couple things in the pipeline, which are going to be really neat. And as to a volume 2, I mean, I would hope that becomes a possibility. I definitely have the track list saved for volume 2 already on my computer,
Wow.
but we'll get there when we get there.
Awesome. I can't wait. Well, thank you so much for your time. It's been an honor and a pleasure to speak with you about the Moaningest Moan of them all, the jazz saxophone of Loren McMurray, 1920 to 1922. Best of luck at the Grammys on Sunday, February 4th, 2024. We're all rooting for you.
Thank you so much, Matthew. I really appreciate it.
It's so cool, Colin, to drop by the channel, and I wanted to take a moment to let you know where you can follow Colin to keep apprised of his other projects. If you are not subscribed to Colin Hancock's YouTube channel, I'm putting a link to it in the description and on the screen right now, and you should really go subscribe because it really is a wonderful place full of early jazz compilations from his amazing record collection. If you like this channel, you're going to love Colin's channel, so do not hesitate, just go subscribe. To help celebrate McMurray and give you a taste of his playing, I'm releasing transfers of 3 records from my personal collection this week. Now keep in mind, I am a rank amateur and not all of my records are in the best condition. So if you want the very best transfers, you're going to have to buy this set. And I'm going to leave a link to the Archeophone Records website where you can buy it in the description of this video. For now though, watch the channel this week for those 3 McMurray videos. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you had fun listening to our very first special guest on the channel, Colin Hancock, telling us all about his Grammy-nominated release, the Moaningest Moan of them all, the jazz saxophone of Loren McMurray, 1920 to 1922. Let me know in the comments what you thought. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the project, on Loren McMurray, on the idea of having special guests on the channel, on ideas for who I should be interviewing next. Would love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to like and subscribe and watch the channel for those McMurray transfers. They will be dropping throughout the next week. I hope to see you real soon.